So one last time, let's walk through where we're at with our index.js file. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about the last step in our store, which is how can we predictably update the current state of our store. So what we have up here is a bunch of objects, and these objects are called actions, which represent the different types of events that are going to be occurring inside of our application, which will eventually change the state of our store. Right here we have a function. This function takes in a state and it takes in an action, and it's responsible for getting us to the next state of our application based on the specific action that is being passed into it. And then we of course have our store. Our store is responsible for four things. It has some internal state, and then we need a way to get the state, listen to changes on the state, and then, as we're going to do right now, figure out a way for updating the state. So before we actually implement this dispatch function, let's go ahead and take a look at what it's going to look like from a user perspective, just as we did with getState and with subscribe. So what we're going to do is, as we've seen before, we can call createStore to get us the store. Now this store object is going to have a getState, a subscribe, and a dispatch method on it. So what we'll do is whenever we call dispatch, and this is where the actions come into play, what we're actually going to dispatch is the action itself. So let's come up here and we'll copy this action, our add to do action. We'll just paste that right there. So with our state management library, a common vernacular that you're going to be saying is you will dispatch an action. So whenever you want to change the state of your application, all you have to do is dispatch a particular action. So this tells us something about how we should implement our dispatch method. First, you're going to know that it's going to take in an action because that's what we're going to pass it whenever we actually invoke dispatch. So now, what is dispatch responsible for? Well, the whole purpose of dispatch, again, is to update the state, but we need to do this in the most predictable manner as possible. Do we have anything inside of our index.js file that will predictably update the state of our store? We do, and if you remember, it was this function right here, our todos function. It takes in the current state as well as the action, and it's going to return us the new state, and it's a pure function, so this is basically as predictable as a function gets. So we know that if we call todos, we'll eventually get the brand new state of our application. So that's one thing we know about dispatch is we probably want to call our todos function because that's what's going to get us the new state, which then we can update here internally inside of createStore. The next thing we know about dispatch is if you remember when we created subscribe, I mentioned that whenever we update the state, what we want to do is we want to go through all of our listeners and inform them that the state has been updated. So the next thing we'll need to do in dispatch is loop over all of our listeners and invoke them. Because again, our listeners is just going to be an array of functions. So let's go ahead and tackle this use case right here first. We need to update the state. That's the whole goal of dispatch. Well, what we can do is we still have access to state with this closure right here because we're still just inside of our createStore function. So we can come in here and say state is going to equal. We can call our todos function that we created earlier because that lives up here. And what do we pass todos? If you remember, todos is going to take the current state and it's going to take the action which occurred, which we're getting when dispatch is invoked. So what's going to happen here is when we call store.dispatch, we pass it the action. This function is going to be invoked, which then means our to-do function is going to be invoked. We pass it the current state, which is just this right here, and then we pass it the action. That's going to come up here and run our todos function. The first time todos runs, state is going to be undefined. So state is going to be set to an empty array. If action.type equals add to do, which it does because that's the action that we're passing in down here, then what's going to happen is we're going to return a brand new copy of the state by using state.concat, because that's going to return us a brand new array. And we're concatenating onto that state action.todo, which is this right here. Now, the next thing we need to do after we update the state, again, is we need to loop over our listeners and invoke each one of them so that they know that the state was updated. So what we can do is we can call listeners, which is this array right here, .forEach. And for each item, or for each listener inside of our listeners array, we can just go ahead and invoke it. So now whenever the state changes, we're looping through all of our listeners and we're invoking them so that they know, hey, the state went ahead and changed. All right, so this looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and test this out now so that we can see if it's working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy our createStore function as well as our todos function. Then I'm going to go ahead and paste those into my console. So now we have createStore as well as our todos function, and we can create a brand new store by calling our createStore function. And now store should be an object with 3 methods on it: get, state, subscribe, and dispatch, and it is. Now if we call store.getState, what we should get is undefined because our state is just this line right here. So now what we want to do before we actually dispatch anything and update our state, let's go ahead and set up a listener using subscribe so that we can be aware, or we can just get like a log in the console whenever the state changes. So what we'll do is we'll call store.subscribe and we will pass it a function. And all we're going to do is we will say the new state is, and then we will just go ahead and how do we get the current state of the store? We call store.getState. And if you remember, subscribe is going to return us a function that when we invoke it will allow us to unsubscribe. So let's go ahead and do something like that. So now, whenever our store changes, or whenever the state internally inside of our store changes, this function is going to be called. And so now what we want to do is we actually want to dispatch an action which will go and change the state internally of our store. So what we'll do is if you head back over to your app, copy this line right here. And if you remember, what we're going to dispatch here is our add to do action, because that's the only action type that we're handling inside of this reducers function for now. So what we should see when we click enter is you'll notice that we have the new state is, and if you look, we now have a new item added to our state of learn Redux. And then we can come in here and let's call store.dispatch again so that we can see that this is working. Let's give it a type of add to do. That always needs to be the same. But the to do this time, let's go ahead and we'll give it an ID of 1. A name of, let's do something that we have already done, so completed can be true. Let's say learn pure functions. And we will set complete to true. So even though we've already done this, sometimes I like to add things I've already done to my to-do list because it makes me feel good. So now what should happen is we called store.dispatch. That went and invoked this function right here. We passed it an action. We got the new state of our store by calling to-dos, passing it the current state as well as the action which occurred. That went and invoked this function right here. The action type was add to do, so we took our state, we created a new array from that, passing in or adding the new to do to that state, and we returned that, which went and added that to the new state right here. We then went through all of our listeners and invoked all of them, which got us this line right here. And now if we look at our new state, what we have is learn Redux, complete false, and we have learn pure functions with complete set to true. And now the last thing I want to show you here is if you'll remember when we call store.subscribe, we got back a new function. So if we now call our unsubscribe function, which was this function right here. And I have a typo up here, so I'm just going to go ahead and be consistent and also have that typo down here because the point's the same. So if we call our unsubscribe function, then if we come in here and dispatch a new to-do, so let's just say learn Vue.js, completed is false. Even though that's going to be added internally to our store, we're not going to be updated, or we're not going to get that console.log because we removed this function from our listeners array by invoking our unsubscribe function that we got back when we called .subscribe. So if you head back over to our index.js file, there's just one small change I want to make. You'll notice here on line 68, what we're doing is we're calling to-dos, passing it the state and the action. This works fine currently the way we've structured our app because to-dos is accessible because it's just in this same file right here. But typically this isn't really going to be the case going forward because eventually once we start separating these out into different modules, then what we'll need to do is we'll need to import this to-dos function. And really what I'm saying is it won't be accessible inside of dispatch. So what we want to do instead is when we invoke our create store function, what if we pass in the main function that's going to get us the new state? In fact, this function right here, this to-dos function, it's called something and it's called a reducer function. Because what it's doing is it's taking in the state and an action and it's reducing those two things to a brand new state. So it's kind of like .reduce if you're used to that with just ES5 JavaScript. So what we'll do is when we call create store, we're going to pass into it a reducer function. So instead of just hard coding that function right here, we'll go ahead and replace that with reducer. And then now if we were to create our store again, what we would do is we would say create store, and store is going to take, or create store is going to take in a single argument, which is going to be our main reducer function, which in this case is just our to-dos function. So again, it kind of worked the way we had it when we had everything in a single file, but once we start breaking things out, it's probably not a good idea to hard code that to-dos function right here. And even more than that, if you think about this again from we are building a state management library, to-dos is going to be a function that the user of our library is going to create, and we need a way to get access to that when they create the store. So instead of hard coding it down here, we'll just accept that function as an argument to create store when create store is invoked. And then we'll know if we call whatever that reducer function is, we're going to get the new state of our store. All right, so if you're with me still, if you followed everything that we've done in this video, you're in a fantastic spot. If you're not, go ahead and rewatch this video. This is probably the most important video throughout the whole course. And really the rest of the videos after this is just going to build upon this video. So again, if you're with me so far, you're doing fantastic. Even if things are like mostly good, you're still in a good spot. It's just if things are really confusing at this point, go ahead and rewatch it. Go to the Facebook group, ask questions, because this, up until this point, everything we've talked about is pretty foundational for understanding the rest. The good news is, ironically, you're about 70% of the way there already. It's just that last 30% is going to build upon what we've done up until this video.